Hi and welcome to the 2023 image editing special. Now I have done 3 previous image editing specials or seminars back in 2021, but of course we've seen a few changes in the Lightroom tools that are available to us to edit images, so I thought it was about time to revisit this particular topic area. Now there's going to be a little bit of a difference here in that I'm going to use the Lightroom version rather than Lightroom Classic. Having said that, once you've downloaded the raw images that I'm going to make available for all of these projects, you will be able to edit them exactly the same way inside of Lightroom Classic. But I do want to spend a little bit of time in Lightroom as well. This is the interface that I'm primarily using now when I'm traveling with a tablet rather than with a laptop. So the raw engine that Adobe Photoshop uses in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom and Lightroom Classic, they're all using the same tools. So whatever we can do in one, we can also do and undo in another. Okay, so without much further ado, let's get started. Now if you want to transfer some of the files that you've been working in Lightroom Classic and import them into Lightroom, formerly known as Lightroom CC, this is the way that I would recommend that you do this. And this is a great opportunity to learn the other interface, and this will come in use if you start working on location with a smartphone or tablet and you want to be able to edit the images on your mobile device. So let's select all of these images. I'll just do Command A or Control A on a PC, and then we'll come up to Library and Convert Photos to DNG. Selecting only convert the raw files, but they are all ARW files, and I'll delete the originals after successful conversion. If you want the original ARW file as well as the new DNG, then you might deselect that. Now I'm just selecting a medium size JPEG preview, embed fast load data, not using lossy compression, and I'm not embedding the original raw file. This will keep the new DNG file a suitable size. So I'll select OK. It'll take a few minutes, obviously, if you're converting very large files into the DNG file format, but it is done. So I'll just come out of this full screen mode now, because now that it's done, I'm just going to click on these files and I'm going to drag them over to a folder which I use for adding files to Lightroom CC. This is going to copy these 4 files into this folder. It's not moving them, it's copying them. So you can alternatively hit the export button here and then choose to export as DNG. Now you are going to have to change the file format settings to DNG, and you're also going to have to choose a few of the other options. You don't want to use lossy compression. Again, you don't want to embed the original raw data, and you're going to have to choose a location for these, such as your desktop or whatever. I'll just cancel this out because I've already exported these. So now that you had done that, you'll come over to your Lightroom, not your Lightroom Classic, and then choose to import new files, or add photos as it's called here. So I'll click on the add photos. I'm going to look at my folder. This is, as you can see, this is a folder I've used before. Once you've imported files from this folder, you can actually delete other files, because Lightroom, unlike Lightroom Classic, is not referencing these files. It's actually copying these files and uploading them to Adobe's cloud service. So we'll hit review for import. Now you see, because all of these ones have been previously added, they're all grayed out. Now what my workflow is at the moment, I'm always transferring my hero images to Lightroom, so I've got access to edit them on the road. So you can see these are the ones that are selected. I'm going to not add them to any album, so I'm just going to select none, and then I can add these 5 photos. And now you see that they're just added now. once we've added them, you do want to check that you're syncing, because these are now going to sync to Lightroom's cloud. Now, there's a lot of preferences in Lightroom which I have covered in my travel seminar, but you'll get the idea. We can now start editing them inside of Lightroom. Anything that you previously edited in Lightroom Classic will be available here, so that if I come over, you'll see that I've already started editing this file, and all of the edits that I did in Lightroom Classic are ready to be re-edited or fine-tuned inside of this Lightroom version rather than the Lightroom Classic. As I said, this is a great opportunity to learn this alternative interface, because once you've got these two tools going, then you'll find you've got a very flexible workflow, whether you're working at home in your studio office or whether you're working out on location. And one of the great things about the albums here is they're very easily to share. I should also stress that you might say, well, I'm syncing my Lightroom Classic. But remember, if you're syncing raw files, the full resolution raw files are not being synced to the cloud. They're smaller raw versions called smart previews. Whereas if you're importing images into Lightroom, then the full resolution raw files are going up to Adobe's cloud. So this is a very useful backup. Again, refer to my Lightroom travel seminar if you want to get more details about my travel workflow. I've singled out a group of images that range from wildlife, landscape, action, portraits, to give you an idea of how I edit. Now, if I'm not talking through these edits, I often just spend a couple of minutes with each image. Now, I don't try and get in too early into the edits. I will try and rate them for good exposure, sharp focus, good composition, etc. And once they've been rated with a single star, then I'll go back and revisit them, do the 2 or 3 minute edit, and then if I'm still thinking the image has potential or promise, then I'll give that to a 2-star rating. The first image that I'm going to show you, I'll just double click on this one. That'll go into the preview mode, and we can see the information. It was captured with my Alpha 1 camera, and also you can see the lens information there. It was captured with my 400mm G Master prime lens with the 1.4 teleconverter. Now we can always see the original before edit just by holding down the / key. We can see the unedited version. Now that unedited version will be the version with the crop applied. So if I wanted to see what the actual crop was, I would just click on the little crop and rotate, and you can see that it's not a massive crop. These planes are flying quite close. I'm shooting this from a balcony, which gives me a little bit of a higher vantage point for these low flying aircraft called the roulettes, which is a display team in Australia. So let's just click on back on that one. You'll also see that in the crop there, I've gone for a crop aspect ratio that is not the 2:3 or 3:2 crop of the sensor. It's a much narrower 2:1 crop. Now, often the crop that I do favor is a 16:9 crop, but in this particular instance, I don't want too much sky above and below the planes, so I've gone for that narrower 2:1 crop. And I'll just drag that back out just to give those planes a little bit more room. Okay, so let's go into the edit for this one, and you can see that we can create versions for this, and this is the original version. And if I wanted to create a version of the edit, I will just click on that, and then just to title this edit 1. And this allows me that if I then start playing with this image further and I realize that it's getting worse, not better, I can always just click on that version to apply that version edit. So there's of course the editing is always non-destructive inside of Lightroom and Lightroom Classic, so we can't really wreck the image in any way. They're non-destructive edits. So what I'm going to do is go back to the grid view and just press the G key on the keyboard, and I'm showed you that image first, not because we're going to take a look at editing that image, but we're going to take a look at editing this particular image, which was captured a year after the first image. Now, of course, the weather conditions have changed dramatically, so this has influenced the way I'm going to edit this particular image. First of all, we can reset any of the controls here just by right-clicking. We can reset the panel adjustments, so we could reset all of the adjustments in the light panel. Now, you will notice that sometimes tools move around between the Lightroom version and the Lightroom Classic version. If you don't find a particular slider in a panel that I'm looking at, you might have to find it in a slightly different panel. This panel inside of Lightroom Classic is called the basic panel, and we often have saturation and vibrance controls, and also some of the controls that we would find inside the effects panel, such as clarity. So you might have to do a little bit of a hunting around if you're going to try and edit these images in Lightroom Classic instead of Lightroom. Now, one of the things I do recommend is, as you're moving forward with your Lightroom journey, is I would download both versions of Lightroom on your desktop and laptop computer. And this gives you a little bit of familiarity with this interface, so that if you do find yourself on location with a tablet instead of a laptop computer, this won't be a completely alien environment. And I'll stick my nose out here and say I think the future of Lightroom probably rests in the Lightroom version, not the Lightroom Classic. At the moment, the Lightroom Classic version does give you complete control about where and how you store your images, possibly on external drives and RAID drives. But of course, the Lightroom version is taking that responsibility from you and storing all of the raw files inside of Adobe's Creative Cloud and online service. You can still edit them offline, but of course, if you're uploading the full resolution raw file and only keeping a low resolution file on your computer, you would need to gain internet access to get access to the full resolution file if you're wanting to maybe do something larger than, say, social media requires. Okay, so without much further ado, let's get started on this particular image, and we can go down to the version control here, and you can see I can click on the original image. And already you can see one of the reasons that I've decided to do more of a dramatic edit. The planes are further away, we've got quite a cloudy sky, and rather than focusing my attention on the planes in this instance, I'm really going to make this an edit that really focuses attention on the clouds rather than the planes. The planes will be a focal point still, but the cloud and the drama and the smoke trails will be the raison d'etre of why I'm editing this particular file. There's no necessary order to your edits in either Lightroom Classic or Lightroom. You can simply just start wherever you feel like starting. So one of the things that I would first want to do in this particular image is go over to the crop, and I'm just going to do a straighten on this image, just so that the planes look like they're flying horizontally. And I'm also going to quickly go down to a 16:9 aspect ratio. The 16:9 aspect ratio is the same aspect ratio of your 4K screens in most instances. Some laptop screens have an aspect ratio of 16:10, but of course they're narrower and wider than your sensor. But if you want the image to fill the screen you're viewing, especially if you're going to view these on a TV, then the 16:9 aspect ratio will fill that screen with no what's called letterboxing on the left and right side. So this is often a classic crop when the image is destined for screen viewing. And once I'm happy with that, I can click on the crop icon again, or click on the edit icon to go over to the edit. There isn't a lot of color happening in this image, so I'm already making a decision that in order to create a very dramatic skyscape, I am going to go in to edit this in black and white. So the first thing that I will probably want to do is look at that profile, Adobe Color, and come over to the right side and click on the profile browser. Now you can see that we can store favorites that we've used before, or we can just go into or selecting a specific profile for what we're trying to do. One of the interesting things about these profiles is we can pick up profiles that emulate the profiles or creative looks that we can apply in camera. That's a useful tip there. The other thing that I'm going to do is go down to the black and white profiles here. Now you'll see that I've got a little star over black and white version 6 here. If you do find yourself coming to a particular profile a lot, you can click in the upper right hand corner and have that more easily accessible. For instance, if I was going to select the black and white 6 but didn't want to come into this profile browser, I could simply click on the drop down menu and my favorites, my starred favorites, appear here. So I've got a few black and whites that I've favorited, black and white 6 and a classic black and white red filter there. The black and white 6, you see as we roll over we get a little preview of differences, and I actually find the black and white 6 is a little bit more dramatic, so I'm just going to go and use that as my starting point. I'm just going to collapse that effects panel and just open up the light panel now. One of the things that I'm going to do now is to create drama is I'm going to add contrast. And so I'm going to add quite a lot of contrast to this particular file. And then I'm going to bring down the highlight values and also bring down the exposure, and already you can see quite a lot of drama already appearing into this image. I'm now thinking the jets are just a little bit low in the composition, so I might just go back to that crop and raise them a little bit higher. You'll see I've got this overlay over here. This is the golden ratio overlay. You can change that overlay just by pressing the O key and get different overlays depending on what it is you're trying to do. This grid pattern can be very useful for architecture, and this is the rule of thirds, and this is a grid, another grid, diagonals, and there's a good way of creating a symmetrical composition so you can find the center. And the one I'm coming back to is that golden ratio. This is the overlay I tend to use most of the time. Let's go back and I'll just click on that crop again. Now I've fine-tuned that crop. Go back to the edit, and one of the things I'm going to do now is to make sure that I've got a nice bright white point and black point for this image. When we're shooting with long telephoto lenses, we often tend to lose a black point, and so the first thing I'm going to do is hold down the Option or Alt key, and then it's basically an Alt key on a PC and an Option key on a Mac, and then I'm going to lower that until I find a black point, and you'll see the black point is in those jets there, and I'm just going to wind that back until I don't see any clipping in those blacks. So we've set a -20 value to get a nice dark tone in those jets that are screaming towards the camera there. Now we're going to set a white point. I'll hold down the Option Alt key again and now move that to the right, and you can see we can move that a long way before we get any clipping or loss of detail in those clouds, and come back. This view that when we're holding down the Alt key is often referred to as a threshold view. So what we've done is we've expanded out the dynamic range to touch both the blacks and whites now. This might lead you to readjust the exposure slider. Okay, so I'm bringing that exposure slider a long way down again. Now I'm getting a sense that the top of the clouds is slightly brighter than the bottom of the clouds, so I'm going to come in with a masking tool now. So we can just click on the word M to open that panel, and what I'm going to do is now is select a linear gradient. I'm going to drag that linear gradient down. You can hold down the Shift key as you drag the linear gradient to keep that absolutely horizontal, and then let go. I'll open up the light panel, and now I'll darken the top of those clouds. So I'm trying to create a nice even bookend. I might even go darker than the bottom, because what I'm thinking now is I'm going to add a linear gradient from the bottom of the image coming up towards the jets. I can fast track this process just by pressing the L key. This is a slightly different keyboard shortcut when using the classic version. So you would actually use the M key or Shift M key to get the radial gradients and the linear gradients inside of the classic version. But I'm working in this Lightroom version, formerly known as Lightroom CC, but now just being referred to as Lightroom, not the Lightroom Classic version. So I'm just going to press the L key. This allows me to create a second linear gradient, just a slightly shorter one this time, and again just bring down the exposure by maybe a third or half a stop there. Just playing by eye here now, rather than looking at the numbers on the sliders. Okay, so I'm happy with that, and I can click on that mask tool or press the M key on the keyboard to come out of that masks. And now what we're going to do is we'll go in and I'll add a vignette, and the vignette will basically just darken off the edges of the image. Now the only thing I've noticed is I've got a patch of very bright sky here, and so that may pull the viewers away from the jets, which is the focal point, and down towards this brightest tone here. So what I might do is I might just press the R key. This opens up the masks panel again with a radial gradient. Just going to drag a radial gradient over that area. You can twist this if you want to, just and then reposition it by clicking on that blue pin. And what I'm going to do now is just bring down the whites of that area so that it's not so bright as to pull the viewer's attention away from those jets. Okay, so once we've done that, now I'm happy to come back into the edit panel. Just to finish this off, I'm just coming down to the detail panel, and you'll see there's a little arrow here where we can open up the other options for sharpening. Now 40 is a very conservative amount of sharpening, so I often just drag that up to 70, 75, 80 if you want a really sharp image. And what I'll also do is I don't want to really sharpen the clouds by sharpening areas that don't have any edges. You're just going to make any noise more visible. So we can basically reduce the sharpening in some areas of the image. Again, hold down the Alt Option key to access the threshold view, and then drag that forward, and you'll see I'm basically all of the areas that are turning black are now not being sharpened, and so really I'm just wanting to sharpen those jets, so I can raise that to a high threshold of 80 there. So now I'm basically not sharpening those areas of the clouds, just the jets alone, just by using that masking slider on the sharpening control there. And so once I've done that, I will probably come over to the versions panel, create a version, and then just put black and white, and that will become my black and white version. I could, for instance, if I wanted to try and see what that would look like now in color, I could, but with all of the other edits in place, I could just come down to color. It's a little bit purple in there, so I probably want to come down and change the colors there, make it a little bit warmer, and take out some of the tints there. Just very minor adjustments, has a big effect on this. And maybe that would become the color version, which I could create now. So there you can see how I can quickly, and it would be even quicker if I wasn't talking you through some of the steps that I was doing there. But that is the edit, and I think I definitely prefer the black and white, so I'll go back to that black and white version there. And now if I press the F key, I can see that full screen, and because it is that 16:9 aspect ratio, it's filling the monitor that I'm viewing this editing on. Okay, so I'll just press the F key again and come back out, and now I'll press the G key and come back to my grid view. Let's take a look at another black and white edit. Now, most of my images do stay in color, but if light is the theme, and that's a driving force about why the image works, then black and white is often somewhere that I would like to take an image. So let's just go into the edit mode. I need to switch to the detail mode there, and you can see the after view. Now if I hold down the backslash key there, you can see the previous edit. Now it's not hugely different, but of course I am fine-tuning the highlights and shadows, and you also see a little bit of what's called keystoning. The verticals of this train station here are leaning in. If you look at both the edges, the verticals are leaning in towards the center, and we can correct those and make them completely vertical by doing what's called keystoning. So we'll be taking a look at that process. This often happens when we're using wide angle lenses and we're tilting the camera slightly higher. If I keep the camera absolutely horizontal, maybe using the level in the monitor or finder, I can actually avoid having to do this in post-production. So let's take a look at this. We'll go into the versions that you can see down here, and I'll click on the original version, the unedited version now. What we could do is, if you decided that you want to keep that version before, I'll just do a Command Z or Control Z on a PC and create that black and white version. So if I don't like the black and white that I'm about to create, I can always restore this one that I've edited first. So I'll just I'll call this black and white one. So I'll hit that Create button and then go back to the original. First of all, let's take a look at the crop. So we'll go into that crop. I'll just hide these versions panel here, and again I think it's a little bit crooked, so we're just going to straighten. Now if you do have an image with converging verticals, the line that you really should be focused on is the central vertical. That is the one that should be straight, and you'll see this grid view as I try to rotate actually helps me out in that manner. Is I can actually see that vertical line on a column here and know when it's actually straight. So I'll just click on that crop to apply that, and what we'll do now is we'll do that keystoning, and that will be found in the geometry of control panels here. So the one we want is the vertical, and again as soon as I come over to these sliders, we get that grid view overlay as well to help me out to know when those side verticals are absolutely parallel to the edges of the image. I think I've just about got it there, maybe a little bit less. I might have to do a little bit of a rotation here as well in order to get that completely straight in the center and on the edges. And again, I'll just try and fine-tune that a little bit more. Okay, and I think that's about right now. Now one of the things that when you do here is you'll see a little bit of white canvas area, non-image data right down there. We can basically do an auto crop to remove any white edges just by hitting that constrain crop checkbox there. I think there's a little bit too much foreground and a little bit too much at the top, so I'm going to go back into that crop and change the aspect ratio to 16:9. And I think that will probably suffice, so I'll come in and apply that as a crop. Now remember, the 16:9 will go full screen. The other thing that I'm going to have to go back into that crop again. I've noticed this very bright highlight on this left edge is a little bit distracting. I don't want the viewers turning their attention away from this central walking figure over to that left hand edge. So I'm going to click on that crop and just come in a little bit tighter on that edge to remove any distracting elements right on the edges of the frame. And it's a little bit left of center, but that's quite good. One of the things I also do when capturing these street images is I think people look better when their legs are apart like this, striding forwards as they're walking, rather than legs together. And you can perhaps time 2 or 3 exposures in order to get that. Now I'm going to come over to the editing panel and come over to the light panel. We've got some very bright highlights here, and I'm going to try and pull a little bit more detail into those highlights, as you can see that I'm doing there. And I also think these highlights in this particular corner here are also an area of possible distraction. So I'm going to come into the masking panel and do a radial gradient. Just drag a radial gradient over those highlights there, come over to the light panel, pull down the whites. I can't really see what's going on in that area, so I'm just going to collapse that panel a little bit and pull down, and also the highlights until they're not quite so bright. I don't mind these highlights being a little bit bright behind, because that is just behind the focus point of this image, but I didn't want them quite so bright in this edge here. I could also do the same thing with another bright highlight over towards this edge and just make that a little bit darker by bringing down the highlights. And the whites controls the extreme right hand side of the histogram, the actual brightest tones. The highlights focuses more on the 3/4 tones, sort of in this area of the histogram here. And sometimes you might need to juggle a little bit of both there. So let's go back, and I think without much further ado, I mean, the color is actually quite good with this image. It's not, it's quite a good color palette, but I think for even more drama, we will go in and select one of my favorites. Remember, we could get to these, my favorites, by clicking on that little profile browser icon and then going to the black and white profiles, or I could just select my black and white 6, or alternatively try the black and white red filter. These red, orange, yellow, green filters, these hark back to the old analog days where we used to apply colored filters in front of the lenses to change the way the colors would record. Basically, red colors are in the composition, the scene, are going to be made lighter in the black and white conversion, and the opposite colors, such as blues, are going to be made darker. I actually like this black and white 6 over that red filter, that classic red filter, so that's the one I'm going to select here and now. Coming back into the light panel, I'm going to add some contrast for a little bit more drama, but I don't want to lose the detail inside of these dark areas, so I'm going to open up the shadows a little bit as well. I'll bring down the highlights a little bit more. Of course, you do need to fine-tune after applying these profiles, because they can be redistributed, so we're just reapplying a little bit more detail in that area now. I'm going to just add a linear gradient. I'm just going to press the L key and just add a linear gradient at the bottom there, just so to lead the eye up towards the focal point of the image. So I'm just going to make that a little bit darker. And that does nicely. And again, one on the top, linear gradient at the top to draw the eye out, stops the eye from leaving the frame here, and just make that a little bit darker as well. I might also come over to the effects panel and drag the well, I'm not going to do this here actually. I'm going to come back to the main editing to get the effects, and the effects that I want is that vignette. The vignette obviously isn't applicable in a localized edit, just to the main edits, and you will find this inside of the effects panel inside of Lightroom Classic as well. And I'll just darken that down. Again, we're drawing the eye into the center of that composition. Now, I probably don't need to do too much here. There are a couple of distracting elements, and this can be a little bit of a controversial edit. Photojournalists working for newspapers are not really allowed to do this, but illustrative photographers do this all of the time, and that is just remove a few of the distracting elements here. I'm just going to zoom in. That's Command plus on a Mac, Control plus on a PC, and now I'm going to hold down the space bar to drag the composition. The distracting elements that I'm thinking of are these just little distractions in the pavement area, and that's gone. We got also one just behind the back of this pedestrian here, slightly larger one, and then I'm going to remove that out, and that's okay. You can just pull that away from the edge of the garment. That's okay. We've got another one just in front of the zipper here on the man's open coat, and I just want to relocate the source point for the texture, and then we're going to move that to the left by holding down the space bar. I'll remove that distracting bit of garbage on the street there. And there's a little bit of a distracting highlight here, getting very fussy now. Just going to click on one end, just click, hold down the shift key, click on the other end of that, and you'll get basically a line drawn between those 2 points. And We could drag that to a particular area. It's like another column that's over there on the left. So if we wanted to replicate this column over to that area, and I think that's okay now. And so we'll zoom out. And I think that basically completes that composition. And again, we'll probably finish off by going to the versions panel, clicking on the create version, go black and white 2, and select create. This gives me the option now to maybe try and see what I did the first time with the black and white 1, and the second edit, the black and white 2. You see this is quite a lot different. I've gone quite a lot darker with the black and white 2, and this is typical of edits. Is you tend to edit differently each time you come to an image. I remember the famous photographer Ansel Adams used to process the same image every year, and it progressively got different as he got older and changed his mind about how he actually wanted that image to appear. So there's nothing wrong with that. We just we edit differently depending on what mood we're in, or we will change our mind over time. And this is the beauty of having these raw files, is we can come back to the source data and reinterpret it with a different frame of mind or a different objective. Let's take a look at editing a close-up image. Now this close-up photograph of this leaf was captured with Sony's FE2070 f4G, which has a magnification ratio of 0.39 times and a very, very close focusing distance. Now this was captured at the maximum focal length of 70 millimeters, and if you want to get in even closer, if you go into APS-C mode, then of course we will magnify that detail even further. If we just go into the information panel here, you can actually see that even though I was using the Alpha 7C, I've actually captured this in APS-C mode. Now it's getting a little bit tight, so you wouldn't want to crop too much more in post-production, but there's enough pixels here. Remember, 3840 is the width of a 4K image, and so we're currently sailing in at 3936. Obviously the 33 megapixel sensors and the R sensors do give you a little bit more flexibility when shooting in APS-C mode and then cropping again in post-production. But we do have enough resolution here. If we come over to the crop here, you can see that I actually haven't taken anything off the sides here. I've just really cropped to the 16:9 aspect ratio. So let's come out of that and let's go to the versions, and you can see the edited version, which is the version you're looking at now, and I'm going to come down to the original version. So let's just close this panel, and we'll start afresh on this edit. So again, as you saw, I did crop this down to the 16:9 aspect ratio, just moving that slightly lower in the frames, just so I've got a little bit of comfort room around the end of this twig here, and there's enough comfort for that lower arc of that part of the leaf there. So I'm happy with that composition, and now I'm ready to carry on editing. Now I do find that the top of the image is just a little bit lighter than I would like, so I'm just going to come in with a linear gradient and just drag that down from the top of the image, holding down the shift key to constrain that to a perfect horizontal, coming into the light panel, just dragging that down as we can see now. So we'll go back to the editing panel, go into the light panel. This is the basic panel in the classic version of Lightroom. Just going to bring the exposure down a little bit, just still a little bit bright, so just bringing that down to half a stop. Now when I was capturing this image, I would be looking to protect the highlights that we see here. I wouldn't want to clip any of that detail. We can check what the highlights are now doing by holding down the Alt key on a PC or Option key on a Mac, and then just finding out where those whites are sitting. You can see that would be clipping, and this is no clipping. So 0 is about the right amount here. And I will then just check we've got a black point. Given that we're quite close up, we probably almost certainly have a black point. When you see colors appearing and not absolutely black areas like that, it means that we're clipping 1 or 2 of the color channels. Now some people actually do like a little bit of denser black tones in their image, so we'll come down to a negative value. Now I would avoid doing that if you're going to print, because those darker tones do have a habit of blocking up when printing, but if they can be viewed quite well on good quality monitors. I'm just going to double click that sensor just to zero that out again. Now, one of the things that I am going to do is I'm going to pull the highlights down just to make sure that we've got good detail in those brightest highlights. And I'm just going to open up the shadows. Now, when I'm opening up shadows and bringing down highlights, I nearly always add a little bit of contrast. Some of these adjustments are quite subtle. As you see, I'm adding contrast. We also seem to be adding saturation, which is a byproduct of adding contrast. So I'd always do that before you think about adding saturation from the color panel. This would probably be found, the vibrance and saturation sliders would be found in the basic panel in Classic. So I don't think I really need to add any more vibrance or saturation in this instance. I'm just going to come down to the effects panel, add a small amount of vignetting. Now you notice with all of these arrows, they are collapsed configurations of the sliders here. There will be more sliders available for the vignette slider by just opening that out, and we can actually change the midpoint of that vignette, basically bringing the vignette closer in towards the center or further away. We can also increase the softness of that vignette if we want. I would often come and lower the midpoint if I am increasing the feather in this instance. Just collapse that panel, and we'll finish up with the detail, and we will open or expand out that sharpening panel, again holding down the Alt Option key when applying the masking slider, so we're not trying to sharpen any of that smooth bokeh, which would do would be enhance the noise present in those areas. And now just increase the sharpening up to a nice crisp 74, 75 as a starting point. Just viewing that in full screen mode by pressing the F key. Yeah, I'm happy with that composition. I'm leaning towards thinking that it might be slightly high in the frame, so I'll just come and just revisit that and pull that slightly lower in the frame, and then recrop and just look at that at full screen again. And yes, I'm happy with that composition now. So I'm happy to go into the versions panel and create a new version, and that will be my edit V2, and hit that create. Okay, so that completes that very quick edit of this close-up detail captured with Sony's new FE2070 f4G lens. Let's edit a landscape image now. I'll edit this one, which is that Seascape. Now this was when I captured this with an Alpha 6600 using Sony's, as it was then, a new 11mm f1.8 prime. Now that 11mm for full frame photographers is an equivalent angle of view that you would capture with 16.5mm if using a wide angle lens on a full frame camera. So that gives us a nice wide angle of view. Now I have actually used this lens on full frame cameras. It is quite a small compact lens, and when I am capturing these ultra wide angle of view landscapes, I very rarely crop tightly, otherwise you'll lose that steep perspective. So if you're shooting with an R camera such as the Alpha 7R4 or Alpha 7V, you're still shooting with 26 megapixels even though you're shooting in APS-C mode. And again, with the ISO is low, the camera is on a very small compact tripod here, your ISO is going to be low, so you don't lose a lot of quality by using an APS-C lens on a full frame camera. Let's take a look at the crop so you can see how much I've cropped this in post. And as you can see, very small amount of crop. This is an Alpha 6600, so we're still 24 megapixels, but you could feasibly put this onto even a 24 megapixel full frame camera and have enough resolution for a 4K ultra high definition final outcome for this. Now the thing that I've done here is just straightened a slightly crooked horizon. I do use the level on the back of the camera, but what I'm doing is I'm picking the tripod up when I think the wave might sort of wash over the camera and putting it back down on the rock. So we are going to have a slightly crooked image that I will want to correct. Let's go into the edit and we'll go into the versions. I'll create a version of this particular edit, and then we'll proceed to go back to the original unedited version. When you're looking at the raw files you have downloaded for this seminar, just check to see whether there are any of these versions already in the files. If not, you might want to create what's called a snapshot if you're using the classic version, so you can get a recording of the edited version before you reset the image and start editing it yourself. Now, as you can see, the original version is a lot less colorful than the edited version. Obviously we're dealing with raw data. The shadows are going to be much darker than we remember them viewing them in camera if you had the D range optimizer switched on, because that D range optimizer lightens the shadows on the monitor and in the Finder and for JPEGs, but not for the raw files. But we always gauge the exposure on the brightest highlights, not what the shadows are doing. We can, if we overexpose those highlights, we're not going to be able to bring them back in post-production. But we can, of course, make the shadows significantly lighter in post-production. So let's make a start with this one. As I said, the horizon is a little bit crooked here. So we'll go into the crop. Okay, so there is, we can just straighten this manually, or you can use this particular slider here. You do have a tool inside of the classic version where we can run a line across the horizontal and have that as the straightening point. But we do have this little grid as I start to turn or rotate the image as a guidance for how much I need to actually rotate this image. And it's only by half a degree or so in order to create a perfectly straight image. And now again, with a lot of landscapes I do like to go slightly wider, so that's 16:9 aspect ratio. If we lose too much of the foreground, I might pull back to 16:10, but I'll try the 16:9 in this instance and just get a little bit more of that foreground. What I'm also eyeing up here is putting that horizon line absolutely in the dead center of the image. A lot of people will try and put the horizon lines on an important line, such as the golden ratio or rule of thirds. I often find the golden ratio more useful for this type of composition, because the rule of thirds, those lines, the upper and lower lines, are quite a long way up and down, and I do find the horizon is a little bit too low or a little bit too high when using rule of thirds compared to the golden ratio. But in this one I'm creating more of a symmetrical composition, in that the horizon line will pass through the dead center of the image. Okay, so now that I've cropped the image, I'm going to come back to the edit. Now I'll come to the light panel first. The highlights are way too bright here, so I'm going to bring the highlights down, okay, and quite significantly here, maybe down to -80. And we're also going to open up the shadows on the rocks, so I've got good definition in here. Maybe plus 50 is good, so we get some good information in those rocks. And again, I'm going to add, if we drag the highlights down and open up the shadows, we tend to lose mid-tone contrast, so I'll add that back in by adding maybe as much as 15 or 20 back to that contrast. Now the sky is appreciably darker than the foreground, so I'm going to balance that in post-production. A lot of landscape photographers, you do this in camera with graduated neutral density filters, but I find that there's a lot more flexibility by doing this in post-production, especially when we don't have a clean, even split between what is sky and what is foreground. If we've got maybe a mountain range or a tree or a rocky outcrop, obviously dragging a graduated filter in front of the lens is going to darken that as well. And we have a little bit more flexibility in post-production just to do localized editing of tone. Okay, so let's go in with that graduated filter. We can come into the masking panel and do that linear gradient. You can just press the keyboard shortcut L to access that, and then just click and drag down. I'm coming all of the way down to just below the horizon line for this, and then coming down to the light panel and darkening this down. I might also add a little bit of saturation, or I could do this globally later, which is what I'm leaning towards doing at the moment. So I'm going to add in another linear gradient. We could just click on this plus icon here, or I could just press the L on the keyboard, and we're going to drag a linear gradient up towards the horizon line. What I'm wanting to do now is just put a little bit of highlights definition into this foreground by bringing up the white slider, and I'm also going to come down to the effects and add some clarity. That adds quite a lot of drama to that incoming wave, which is blurring slightly because of the longer exposure. I can check the exposure for you by coming to the information panel, and you can see it's 3/5 of a second. Not an ultra long exposure, because I did want some definition of the streaking water, and we're going to lose that with, say, long 10, 20, 30-second exposures. So we're playing creatively with the exposure times here, and I'm finding that long exposure does need a tripod, but not too long creates that right sort of texture I'm looking for in that water. Now we're going to come back to the light panel. Just check my whites and blacks. I'll hold down the Alt key on a PC, Option key on a Mac, check for whites. Now we can drag that quite a long way up before we get any clipping in that bright sky here. Maybe a little bit too much. I'm just going to come down. Not going to have absolute white point in this image, and we'll again check the blacks. I probably will have a good black point already. We do, in the bottom right hand corner. Now we could go back into that linear gradient, because we've got a little bit of clipping in those rocks, and we could go back into that linear gradient in the bottom, come back to that light panel, and just raise the blacks up there just a fraction on that lower edge, so we basically remove that clipping from that lower edge. It's a subtle detail, and you could possibly allow a little bit of clipping in that rock if you prefer. We're going to come back up to the color panel, and I'm going to add quite a lot of vibrance. And what happens with the vibrance slider, it tends to try and keep colors that might go out of gamut and lose a little bit of detail in gamut. It's a preferred slider to the saturation slider, but the Adobe engineers added another algorithm into the vibrance, and it was trying to hold back the saturation values of skin tones from becoming too saturated. And so if you do have any colorful tones, such as the oranges, that are not responding well to the vibrance slider, you can give a small kick with the saturation slider just to make those oranges a little bit richer in your composition. Now we've got corners that are a little bit light here, so I just want to go down to the optics. When I was first editing this image, we didn't have a profile available for this 11mm lens, so I'm just going to check that we have enable lens corrections applied. We do. There is a built-in lens profile being applied for the chromatic aberration. I could check that, but it's not going to make any difference because that was already removed in camera. We could also see that this is the correct profile for the lens. It's the Sony 11mm f1.8. These slightly lighter color corners is something that I will basically darken manually by coming into the effects panel, and we'll come in with the vignette and just darken that down, not too much. If you go pretty much too much more than -25, people will start noticing the vignette in your post-production editing. So what we'll finish up with is again in the detail panel, we'll do a little bit of sharpening. Again, I will make all of the rocks quite crisp in this one, so we'll raise that up to 75 for a nice amount of sharpening. I don't want to be sharpening the sky, so we'll add some masking in, and we'll get rid of all of that sharpening in everything except the textures in the rocks and just the edges of the clouds there. And if you did want to make this with a little bit more texture, you could come in with the effects panel and add a little bit of clarity or texture just to give a little bit more drama in those rocks. You do need to be reasonably subtle with the clarity slider, in my opinion. Okay, and so that is the edit there. If you're finding that this is a little bit too bright in this area, you could come in perhaps with a radial gradient and just knock down the brightest areas of tone there. And I'll just reposition this a little bit lower. You could come in with the whites and just drag that a little bit darker in that area. You do want quite a lot of feather in this filter here, so we're not too aware of the transition between those darker highlights there. So that's basically completes this edit. So I'll go to the versions, create a new version, and call this edit 2. Let's take a look at the image of the butterfly that I've captured with the Alpha 7R5. You can see I'm in the info, and you can see we've got a healthy resolution here of over 9,500 pixels, but you can also see that it was captured with the 100-400. Now its maximum aperture, shutter speed of 1/250th. You can see it's ISO 1000, so there will be a little bit of a grain structure, but probably not too problematic. Without much further ado, we can go in and look at the edit. Now I often, I'll have to switch to detail there. I often use the 100-400 to get very close to a small wildlife. I prefer this to using maybe Sony's 90mm macro lens. The macro has quite slow focusing, so I prefer to get in nice and close with the 100-400, which has got a 0.35 times magnification ratio. We could get in even closer if I went into APS-C mode or put on the 1.4 times teleconverter, but as you can see, this is possibly close enough. We can see the before edit by just going to the versions here and clicking on the original. So you can see I haven't cropped very much at all. So I've got in nice and close with that 100-400. Focus can be very tricky on cameras when we're looking at perhaps butterflies that are moving slowly and we don't have a lot of depth of field. So the subject detection and the insect mode of the subject detection on the Alpha 7R5 really came into its own on this particular part of the review process of that Alpha 7R5 camera. A lot of time I can often do what the subject detection is doing just by dropping down to a spot and maneuvering that spot onto the area I want to focus. But certainly the insect subject detection made light work of this particular process, and I had a remarkable number of pin sharp images of the heads of insects here. Okay, without much further ado, with the light panel I'll bring down the highlights because we've got nice information in those bright highlights on the wings that I want to be able to be quite visible, and we don't want the shadows of the dark parts of the insect too dark, so we'll just lighten those up nicely so we can see the information underneath this part of the head wing. Add a little bit of contrast, which is often what I do if I drag the highlights down and open up the shadows. This also adds a little bit of color saturation. If it's not enough, we'll come to the color and I'll just pump up the vibrance here, much preferring the vibrance slider in this instance to the saturation slider, and make this really quite colorful. I like colorful images, so there we go. So that's a nice image there. It doesn't really require much cropping. I actually like the composition, but if you did want to go full screen on a TV or a 16:9 aspect ratio computer monitor, you might want to consider dropping down to that 16:9 aspect ratio and seeing whether that is something that you would prefer. I'll just put that upper line of the golden ratio overlay here on the top of that eye, and I'm also looking down into the bottom corner. I do like diagonals that sort of exit right from the corners, so I'm going to favor this as the composition here now. Okay, going back into the edit, I do want to put a couple of linear gradients on this one, so I'll just press the L key and bring a linear gradient in, and I'll just bring the brightness down slightly. I often do this in preference to, or as well as adding a subtle vignette. So I'll add a second one, another press of the L key, coming up from the bottom of the image, down maybe a third of a stop or half a stop or so, and I think that's already looking pretty good. Anything else is going to be fine-tuning and very subjective edits. We could actually drop in a third linear gradient and just come in over there on the left side, which is a little bit light there, and it's also a little bit cool. The greens are a little bit cool, so I'll just drop the exposure down and also go into color and add a little bit of warmth to that edge of the image, because as you can see the right side is very colorful there. And just coming out of the masking there, and what we'll do is we'll go into the effects, and I'll just bring in a small amount of vignette there. I'm already reasonably happy with this, but I will go into the detail just to expand that out, and again raise that up to a nice healthy 75, and also holding down the Alt Option key, because I don't want to be sharpening that bokeh, just want to be sharpening the edges of that insect there, like so. And now I'm really quite happy with that edit. As I said, there wasn't a whole heap to do with this image. I could just press the backslash key just to see a before and after, but that is definitely my preferred version of this. So I'll just go in and create a new version and edit to, and hit create. This image I captured at a triathlon event at a local beach. Now it's captured with the FE70 to 200 f2.8 G Master, and it's the second version, the Mark II version. It was an important upgrade for anybody wanting to shoot sports with a 70 to 200 because of the much faster focus motors, especially when you're shooting things at close range, and those series of lens elements have to be moved quite rapidly as subject matter might move quickly towards you. So we've got a healthy physique of this guy. I have noticed that his chest is absolutely huge, but one of the saving graces of editing this particular image is Adobe's new AI masking tools. As you can see, I'm pressing the backslash key now to see the before edit view. It's typical to see shadows much darker when we're working with raw images because the D-range optimizer settings aren't applied. Now I'm protecting the highlights in capture, making sure that that sky doesn't clip or overexpose in post in capture, because I don't want to be able to bring that sky darker in post-production editing. So it might look a little bit dark initially, but this is what I would expect from this type of capture where we've got these brighter backgrounds. Because of that bright background, I may have raised the exposure compensation during the capture stage of this process, but only so far as to not clip those bright highlights in the background. Okay, so without much further ado, let's get to editing this image, and I'll just hit versions and hit the original there. Okay, there's a little bit of a crop here, obviously working with a 200 at maximum magnification, the 200mm focal length, and it's not quite close enough, but of course we're working with an Alpha 7R5 camera here, so we've got plenty of resolution to crop tighter. So I'll just do a little bit of a straightening. I think I can get away with a 16:9 aspect ratio crop again here, which will fill the screen, and just reposition that. I do want him to be center in the frame. Okay, so I'm just bringing that in a little bit tighter, just so he's absolute center in frame. I don't want to lose any of that reflection, so I think that's a good crop to have. Okay, before I could just go into the basic light panel and drag down the highlights to make that sky a little bit darker and open up the shadows, but I'm really going to lean on an AI mask here to select that background in order to get the balance between the darker subject and the brighter background correct. So I'm just going to go into that masking panel. It's scanning for people. It's found the person. I could make the person bright and then the whole image lighter, or I could just select the sky, or I could select the whole background, which would include the foreground water, and then make all of that darker as well. Now it is sky, so I might also go in and just make the temperature a little bit cooler as well. Add another mask. This time we'll select the subject. You might also be able to select the person if that was identified as well. And I'll just to make this a little bit brighter and a little bit warmer, reflecting the skin tones, which I think were a little bit cool in the previous version, so that's good. Now that I'm good with that, I'll just come over to the edit panel. We'll just revisit this just to make sure we've got a whites and blacks selected here. So the whites could be raised quite a long way, and also the blacks can possibly be lowered. This is often the case when using telephoto lenses. As we're shooting through more ultraviolet light or haze, then we tend to lose that black point. So it's a good tip to often visit the negative black value when using the telephoto lenses. Just going to finish this image off by adding a small vignette just to draw the image eye of the viewer in slightly, and then finish off by adding my typical sharpening amount. You may have your own preferences for sharpening, and because I don't want to sharpen the bokeh because there's no point, I'll just raise the masking slider. By failing to raise the masking slider, you will notice the noise in the background would be slightly more noticeable, and I want to avoid having to do a noise reduction on this particular image. So that really concludes this quick edit of this triathlon event here. This was an image I captured in Rajasthan in India in February this year. I was using the new FE 2070 f4G. Now with a f4 maximum aperture, and obviously this woman is in a dark interior, the ISO has gone up to ISO 5000. But of course with the new AI technologies for noise suppression, this isn't such a big deal as it used to be. So what I'll do is I'll just show you how I edited this image and how we can use the new noise suppression moving forward into the future. First off, I'll just come over to the edit panel there and come over to versions, and we'll go and select the original there. One of the things you may notice when I take all of the edits off is you may notice that the focal point should be the woman's face, but it's one of the darker elements in the composition now, and so the much brighter foreground elements, which have got collecting more of the daylight, are quite distracting. So we do have to sort of redistribute the tones so the viewer knows where they're supposed to look, which is on the face, and are not distracted towards the bottom of that frame. So let's go into the light panel. We could do make the shadows a little bit lighter and also the highlights a little bit darker, but we are going to have to do some localized editing to manage this. So one of the things that I will do now is go into that masking panel. What we can do is we see it's identified the person as well, so we can select that person if we wanted to as a mask. But I'm just going to select the background, which is pretty much the opposite of the person there, and just come in and darken that down slightly. Okay, but of course that won't resolve the fact that the foreground is too bright. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with a radial gradient, and then just drag that over this area of the foreground, and I might take that quite wide because really what I want to do is make sure that all of those brighter elements are going to be darkened by what I'm about to do now, which is to drag down the highlights and also a little bit of help with the exposure. We could also add a second radial gradient. I'll just press the R key again. These will be different shortcuts for classic users. I'm just going over that very bright corner there. Also adding a vignette could also bring that corner down, but will also bring the other three corners down as well, just so we're not distracted by those elements. A third radial gradient, I could drag that over the woman's face here and just reposition that and just add maybe a half stop. In the old days I would have maybe used fill flash for this type of stuff, but adding an extra half stop here is doing a nice job. Maybe a little bit high in the saturation, so we'll just drop the saturation slider down a fraction there. Okay, now if I zoom in on this image, you will see the grain that we're looking at here. Okay, this is ISO 5000. The A7R5 and A7R4 are a fraction behind some of the other lower resolution sensors, but as I said, this is not really a problem anymore because what we would do is we would come down to the detail panel and then hit the denoise option here. and okay, so it's underway. So it's going to take a few seconds to generate the preview. This will be where faster computers will certainly get through these advanced AI algorithms just a little bit faster. So we can choose a lower or higher amount. So I'm just going to drag this and see what it's doing to the background. I think that's great, actually. We don't want to add too much noise reduction and start losing fine detail. So I don't think I need to play with this at all. I'll just click the enhance. Now it does create a new raw file. So you will have the unedited noise reduction file, and then you'll have a new file with that new noise reduction applied. And it's taking a few seconds to get through this, but then it is a 60 megapixel image that it's working on. So you would expect it to take a few seconds to do this. DxO Pure Raw 2, a Topaz would also have the same issues there. And now we can zoom in, and you can see, wow, look at that. Isn't that great? It's almost as if this image was shot at ISO 640, not ISO 5000. Now I could do some more edits, but pretty much I am there. I do realize this right side of this is still a little bit bright, so I might just come in and press the L key and just drag a gradient over. It's just something happened there, so I'll just backtrack, add that linear gradient again, and hold down the shift key to constrain that to a perfect vertical, come in and drag that exposure down. I really don't want anything to be distracting from the viewer's attention going to the woman's face there. Now she's slightly off center, so some people might want to crop this. As you can see, it's an uncropped image at the moment, but some people might want to come in and put her closer to the center of the frame there. I'm sort of okay with the slightly off-center composition, and I don't want to lose this lovely archway here, so I am making a small compromise here by having a slightly off center here, and again just press that crop tool, and I think I'm more than happy with that edit. I'll just go full screen to get rid of the distracting user interface, and I think that is an excellent image. I'm really happy with the outcome of both the lens, the camera, and the new denoise feature there. This is another one of my portrait images that I captured in Rajasthan in India earlier this year. Now you can see from the information on the right hand side that it was captured with the 90mm f2.8, which is a Sigma full frame lens. Maximum aperture of 2.8, but you can see when we're working quite close we still get plenty of figure ground separation or background blur. Now working at 1/125th of a second, which is probably as low as I want to go, but the portrait figure is quite static, hence I've moved down from my ISO auto minimum shutter speed of 1/250th to 1/125. Okay, so that's enough about how I captured this. If we take a look at the before version by pressing the backslash key, we can see that there's quite a lot of distribution of brightness values going on here. The background is quite bright, and we can see there's also a difference between tone and color between the hand and the face. We can also see the eyes are quite dark. We've got highlights on the nose and chin. If I show you the after version, you can see how all of that has been resolved. We've got much brighter eyes. Those highlights on the nose and chin are now evened out with the rest of the exposure, and the hand is closer in color and tone now to the face, and that background is darker. So again, we're going to lean heavily on some of the AI masking tools, which is really why I wanted to make a 2023 version of this image editing seminar. So let's go into the image editing, and we'll take a look at where we can backtrack to the original version. I'll click on the original. If I wanted to keep a version of the current edit, then I'll just do that. I'll just do edit 1 and then hit the return enter key, and now go back to the original. Okay, let's go over to the light panel. As I said, if you want to create a different developed default, we could do that, because what I'm doing most of the time in most of my image editing is raising the shadow values to 50 or more, lowering the highlights to 50 or more, and then also raising the contrast to 15 or so. And then I'll just fine tune the exposure. Sometimes when I've got very bright backgrounds, I purposely underexpose slightly to protect the highlight tones. In this case, we can see that we're not clipping those tones, so we're okay. Got a very bright highlight tone in the corner there, which I could just resolve by coming in and cropping a little bit tighter. In this instance, it's not one of the images that I actually want to crop into the 16:9 aspect ratio. I think I need the full height to include the hand and the eyes there. And so I'm just getting rid of that unnerving highlight in the extreme right hand corner and then coming back out. We've also got a few distractions that I'm seeing now, but I could remove them now or later. A hair on the fabric and down here on the hand. Given I've noticed it now, let's just go straight in and edit that. We're just zooming in. We're going on that little band-aid tool there, and quite a small size, and I'm just going to drag that along the hair there, and we should probably get a good match there. Just got to make sure that edge lines up, so we might need to just reposition the source point just to push that edge back on track there. And while I'm here, I could also just remove that little blemish there, and now we'll just apply that and zoom back out. Got another one over there, which I should have done while we were in there, so let's go back in. And again, I'll just Command plus a couple of times to get in nice closer there. I can use press the space bar to reposition this into the center of the working area. Got a little bit of a fine line there, which I want to remove. And then also this one down here, just plot the course of that hair going down. And we might be able to, if we're lucky, remove this in one line, but if not, we might have to break that up into two. And again, just to get this alignment here, just get that source point and just push that in. Can't move it too much. Okay, so another couple there is let's just move that down there, and another faint line here. This one's hardly noticeable, but given I've zoomed in and noticed it, we'll move that as well. Okay, I think we're done there, so let's just go back to the edit panel and zoom out. Right, okay, so let's start with the background first. So we'll go into the masking panel, select the background, and darken that down. I might just drop down on the exposure, but also on the whites as well, just to get rid of some of those very bright highlights in the background. We could also try using the highlight slider as well. Sometimes you might notice a difference in outcome by using highlights or whites, or sometimes you have to use both together. Now I'm just going to go in and click on that plus tool, and we're going to grab our radial gradient. You see the keyboard shortcuts are listed alongside the tools. These keyboard shortcuts are annoyingly different in the classic version, so I think you'll be using M and Shift M to get the linear and radial gradients there. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just grab a nice long radial gradient, and I'm just going to twist that into position and drop that down over the hand. This really needs to be a little bit darker. Okay, not that dark, maybe just a third of a stop or so, and quite a lot warmer, so it matches the warmer skin tones of the face there. So maybe up to a value of 20 or 30 there will create a closer match between those two tones. Now we're going to go in and more radial gradients, so this time I'll just use the keyboard shortcut R to grab a little radial gradient over that eye, and we'll add some light into that eye, maybe half a stop or so, 2/3 of a stop. That's nice. And one more, another R on the keyboard, and again just a radial gradient. You can use the brush tool, but sometimes it's just faster instead of brushing just to put these radial gradients in. I'll just show you the brush tool. If could carry on using radial gradients, but I'll just use the brush tool as an option here. We do need to click on that little triangle because you've got this auto mask feature. This can be useful if you're trying to stay behind the edge, a clearly defined edge, but it can work against you sometimes, and so sometimes I will want to uncheck that. And we're going to work with half a stop negative exposure. I'm just going to drop that over the highlight of the nose now. I might need to come down closer to a stop to bring that in. And sometimes when I'm bringing this in, I also want to occasionally want to warm up those areas so they're not too grey in comparison. I might try and do this with the same brush now. I don't have to do separate radial gradients. I could just come in down over that lip and the chin now to get rid of that. I think we might even go down more than the 2/3 of a stop and just go down a little bit more. Okay, I think that's evening it out quite nicely now with the rest of the skin tones. So we'll come out of the masking panel and zoom out to see what I've got. This colour on the fabric here is a little bit bright for me. Now we could again put brush tools or radial gradients, or we could even attack it in the colour panel, and so we could come down to the colour mixer component. We've got this little on image target here, and we could select that, and I'll just go over and select hue, or sorry, luminance, because I want to make this color slightly darker. We can then come over and drag that down to make it darker. We could also then change the target to saturation, and then you can see which way to go. You're getting a clear indication that left is less saturated, so let's just take that down a fraction so it's not quite so vibrant. Okay, of course it's happening on both sides, so if you only wanted it to happen on one side, you would attack this with a slightly different tool. I'm going to come back out now, and let's just finish this off. I'll select optimum white point for this image, which we should be able to identify over there on the bangles, and then an optimum black. We should already be very close to having an optimum black because I am working very close. It's usually only with the longer telephoto lenses that we have those issues with a black point needing to be set. I don't think the bangles are so bright that they actually need to be brought down. I quite like them that bright, so I'll leave them at that tone. I'm just coming over to effects. I do like a subtle vignette, so I am putting in that subtle vignette again here now, and I think we're pretty much done on that. Now some people might want to modify the background completely. You know, another version of this would be to go back into those masks panel, select this background mask and see how far you can push it. Now you might be limited by how far you can push it without getting an unsatisfactory edge on this background. But if you really wanted to remove that as a distraction, you could push it a couple of stops darker. You don't have to just stop at 1/3 of a stop there. If you've got a little bit too much distracting detail, you might also go into color and lower the saturation of those background colors, though, especially over there on the left side. If they were a little bit sharper, and in this case they're not, we could actually go into the detail panel and do a negative sharpness to soften them up even further. If that doesn't have a profound effect, we could go into texture and do a negative texture as well. So that's a quick way of editing this image, and I'm more than happy with the outcome of that. I should also point out that I would sharpen this image before outputting it. So again, I would probably raise that as usually as a starting point of 75, and then the masking slider just coming down there, making sure none of the background blur is being sharpened there, but I do want that hair being sharpened, so that's a good outcome now. And I would come into my versions panel and do an edit too. Okay, and sometimes it's worth editing an image multiple times just so that you can compare one edit that you've done one day with an edit that you've done on a different day, just to see which one you prefer. Okay, I'm pretty good with both of those, so I'll leave that as it is. Okay, so and then I'll come back out to that grid view just by pressing the G key on the keyboard. In the previous portrait editor, you saw me darkening the background by using background mask. I've done half of the work for me this time by just choosing the background behind my subject carefully. Sometimes if you have a dark interior, such as an open doorway, that is going to be very dark naturally, so it's almost like a studio background without having to move this guy into a studio environment. So let's take a look at how I've edited this one in post-production, and let's see if we can create a slightly different version. So I can show you the well, let's just save this one first. So I'll just go edit one, hit the return enter key, and then we'll go and look at the original. Okay, so as you can see, there's a little bit more work to be done. Now you might say, well, the shadows are very underexposed, especially the face, and you're going, is this a misexposure? And the reality is no, I'm trying to underexpose slightly in order to protect the highlights. So I might have even done a negative exposure compensation in camera, knowing full well that I'll recover the shadows of the face in post-production. The shadows wouldn't have looked so dark in camera because of D-range optimizer, but with the raw file that obviously is not being applied to that raw file. We can also see the guy is just tipping into sunshine, and so we're getting the shawl here is quite bright, and I will want to modify that when I'm editing the image. So, and it's also crooked. Okay, obviously I've taken this quite quickly. Sometimes the camera is only at my face for a second, and I'm not too worried about crooked images. I'm more worried about keeping the pose natural and without being too awkward. And also I sometimes feel for the sitter, you don't want to be pointing the camera at them for 3 minutes. You really just want to be able to take the shot and then them see your smiling face again. So we'll just close that panel. And first, that tilt is actually annoying me, so I'll just come in and do a rotate there until, and you can see that grid is helping me out here. I don't want to lose the top of that turban, so that's probably as tight as I want to go, and we'll commit that as a crop. Okay, probably maybe a little bit more. Sometimes I'm not overly concerned with cropping into the top, and I might have to do that in this instance. So given that I am going to lose the tip of that turban, I might even come in a little bit more and put the eyes on that upper line of the golden ratio. So in this case I'm not going to be able to get the top of the headwear, but I'm sacrificing that to get the optimum composition. Straight nose running down that center line there, and eyes on the top of that golden ratio line. So I'll commit that as the crop. Now we're going to go in, and I'm going to select a radial gradient. So I'll just come in and press the R key, and I'll just drag that over because we do want to make that face at least a stop lighter. Okay, maybe even a stop and a half, like so. The eyes are still quite dark, so I might come in with a brush tool, and we'll go in and pick up a brush, and I'll probably want to add another 2/3 of a stop to those eyes. So just going in and pushing a little bit of an extra brightness into the dark eyes there, just to make a little bit more of an attraction to those eyes. Right, so we got a problem with the sunlit side of the shawl, so I'm going to do this with I'll start with a radial gradient and just drag in that radial gradient over that right hand side here, making sure that's fully encompassed, and bringing down the exposure, maybe also the highlights. Notice the saturation goes a little bit lower in doing that, so I might just pump up a little bit of extra warmth in this side of the shawl here. Maybe ease off on the amount of darkening there, like so. Okay, so we'll go and select another mask, and this time I'll select the subject, I really was going to select the background, but rather than backtracking, I could just click that invert option there, which will switch that around. So now I'm controlling the background rather than the subject. It doesn't really matter which way you go. You can make the subject lighter or the background darker, just to balance up what it is I'm trying to do. This is very distracting. I think it's the side of a box here now. I could try and darken that down with a radial gradient and knocking the whites down, or I'm tempted now just to come out and hit that patch tool, increase the size of the heel there. Now I'm just clicking on the close square bracket key rather than moving the dial, because I do like to have the icon over to really get an idea of the size of that brush I'm working with. And then obviously it's selecting a nice neutral area without any detail, so that should be a good fit in there, and we'll come back out. Okay, so I think there's a little bit of an evidence of something still going on in there, so I might just come outside of that heel area and wipe another line across the lower edge, because I can still see evidence of where that box or repair was done. Let's just see whether 2 will do the job. Yep, no one's going to notice that now. I think perhaps the face perhaps isn't as bright as I would like, so I'm going to go back into that mask, come back in with the face mask, and just raise that even more. Saturation's getting a little bit high for me, so I'm going to come in with the color and lower the saturation of that face. I think the nose is a little bit bright as well, so I might just come in with a smaller radial gradient and remove a little bit of dark, or lower the darkness of that nose. I could do that on the actual radial gradient. I could hit a subtract option, but I'm just adding a second radial mask in this instance and just lowering the brightness of that nose just a fraction, so it sort of evens out with the rest of the skin complexion. Got a few minor spot distractions which I'm noticing, which I probably want to out. So I'll just remove a light spot on the fabric there, and another one down on the fabric there, and it's pretty much close to what I want. I've noticed there's a little bit of a distraction in the lower left hand corner. I don't like distracting elements right on the corner, so I'm coming back into that crop marquee and just coming back in to remove that, and I'll have to just crop tighter again to put those eyes back on that golden ratio line there, and I've got that done now. So yep, that's pretty good. That's lower corner there is still quite bright, so maybe another radial gradient over there to lower that down and even that out. And I might come in and just darken the corners even more by using a vignette. Okay, that's working quite well. And finish off with some detail. Again, just dial in 70-75, which is usually my starting point for the sharpening, and as per always just going in with a mask, because we don't really want to sharpen anything in the background, just the edges of the tunic and the eyes and some of the skin texture. I would take that higher if I didn't want to sharpen the skin texture, but in this case I like the skin texture being sharpened. You can only really get a full idea of your sharpening outcome by zooming in to 100%. You don't get satisfactory visual outcomes in Lightroom when you're viewing at smaller magnifications. So to get an idea of the final sharpness, that's really where you want to go. And I am very pleased with this. So this is the lens I'm using here. That's the 2070 f4G. This is really quite a sharp lens, compact for travel and sharp. Just before I finish off on this image, I'm just noticing one more distracting little spot. Okay, it's not, they don't annoy everyone, but now I've noticed it, we want to remove it so people are not pulled away from looking at the eyes of this nice portrait, character portrait. And again, come back in to the versions and create a new edit there. So edit 2. And because I edited this one maybe a month ago, I've got no idea how I originally edited it now, so we could take a look at that edit. This time I've got the top of the turban with a slightly crooked tilting head, and the second version, okay, the Edit 2 here. Okay, quite different, but okay, so you can make up your mind which one you prefer in that edit. In this edit of this sadhu that I captured in Varanasi on the banks of the Ganges, I want to look at how we can, instead of editing everything from scratch with all the sliders set to 0 by default, sometimes you may have noticed that I'm constantly lowering the highlights, constantly raising the shadows, adding a little bit of contrast, a vignette, sharpening the image. Now, if you're getting into those repetitive edits for almost every image you do, it's best off starting from that point and then just fine-tuning the image. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to show you how we can do this. So I'll take this image of this sadhu and I'll make some basic edits, not because I think they're the best suited for this image, but because it's generally what I do with most of my images. So let's go to the versions panel and we'll click on the original here. So that takes away all of the edits. And if we open up the panels, you can see indeed all of the sliders are now set to 0. Let's close this panel. Now, just for your information, you'll see that I've captured this with an Alpha 7R Mark V with the FE2070 F4G. Now, I'm using my portrait memory recall, which would be using a wide aperture, but in this instance I've stopped down the aperture to f7.1. Now, I was noticing when I was photographing a lot of these guys with big bushy beards that shallow depth of field wasn't always the best approach, because having the eyes pin sharp but the beard slightly defocused wasn't always the preferred outcome. So in this particular one, I've overridden my default portrait setting by closing the aperture down, and as you can see here, when I zoom in, you'll see the beard is pin sharp. Because I'm so close, I'm still getting good defocus, and it's because it's not just about aperture that controls depth of field, it's also about your close proximity to the subject matter. Macro photographers, for instance, know you get very shallow depth of field even when stopped down to f8, f11 when working so close. So because I am working close on this tight head and shoulders portrait, I'm still getting the depth of field that I require for good figure ground separation. So I digress. Let's go back to the edits, and let's first off set a negative highlight value. Instead of dragging the sliders, I'll just go holding down the shift key. I'll just go down and select -60 on the highlights. I'll do the up arrow on the keyboard, 6 clicks with the shift key held down for +60. I'll go up 20 on the contrast. I'll go up a third on the exposure. This image doesn't need this exposure adjustment, but often when I am working, especially when the sun's out, I often lower the exposure slightly to protect highlights, and then end up having to raise more than half the time, having to raise that exposure by a third of a stop or more in post-production editing. Whites and blacks very much depends on the lens and conditions that we're working with, so I won't make any modifications to those because these will be defaults applied to all images, not just to some. I will come down into the effects panel, and I do like a negative value on the vignette, so I'll just go down 15, no 15, so I might have to do -15 on the keyboard and then hit the return enter key for that one. Detail, you're probably aware that I'm going up to 70-75 in most instances, and I'll raise the masking slider to a similar value there. So now I've overridden the vignette, the detail panel, the light values. If I did have a custom profile that I wanted to use instead of the Adobe Color, but if you don't, I'll leave it at the Adobe Color. We then go into presets, and then you can create a preset just by clicking on the little plus icon. Now I'll just click on that preset so you can see, you can name it, you can decide the folder that the preset's in. If you want to create a new folder, here they call it group, create a new group of presets. I'll just have it going into the presets. Okay, if I want it to appear at the top, I'll just put an underscore and the word start, and I'll click that. I've already done this once. You can see this 01 mg start there, which would have a similar sort of a thing. So this is the preset I could click on. each time I want to start with that. But I can have this preset applied automatically to all images on import, so all of them will start with these modified values, and I'll show you how to do that next. Just a word about this. Once I do this, if I double click now, you'll see that the slider sets to 0 because Adobe still has the Adobe default. So I'll just raise that back up, or I could have alternatively clicked on this profile, which resets all of those sliders. But now I'm going to apply this preset now as a default starting preset that will be applied to all images. So I'll go up to my Adobe Lightroom preferences, okay, and in the import section we go to raw defaults. Raw default is currently the Adobe default, and what I'm going to do now is come down to preset, user presets, start, and that's where I've now overridden the Adobe default, and I'll click done there. So now with this modified raw developed defaults, if I double click on a slider, it goes back to the default, not to 0. Okay, we can of course remove all of this behavior and go back to the Adobe defaults if we change our minds at any time in the future. Okay, so I'll close the panel and we'll start editing this particular image. I will lower the exposure because I think standard exposure was good for this one, and what we'll do now is we'll select the masking panel. It's scanning for detecting people. It's found one, so I'll hit the return enter key, so that becomes a mask, and I could come into the light and open up the shadows just of that guy. It will leave the shadows in the background alone. I could select background as well as a separate mask and maybe make that a little bit darker by half a stop. I might come in with a linear gradient and just take the left side of this image a little bit darker still, which draws us in towards the figure in the center. Well, I'm reasonably happy with that already. I could go and add a radial gradient to just the face of this Sadhu, and I'll add a third of a stop there, maybe a little bit of contrast as well, maybe lowering the black slightly. While I'm in this panel, I think what I'll do is I'll create a new mask, linear gradient, and just darken the base of the image. I think the tunic at the bottom is just getting brighter and drawing us away from the face, so I'll just drag that up and lower the exposure. Just by eye now, I'm just working down, not really looking at the slider figures, but just looking at the image as I drag that slider, and I think that will suffice. I think we're pretty much done now, and as I said, because we've created that new developed default, I know that I won't have to go in and finish off with the detail, because that's part now of the incoming default. Okay, so I'm happy with that, and we could go in and create a version, of course, until we've got a record of that sequence of steps. So I'll sign off on that one, and let's move over to the next image. Let's take a look at editing this particular landscape that I captured in Rajasthan. You can see I've captured it with the 2070 f4G. Now, when I originally edited this image, there were no profiles available for this lens, so perhaps the first thing I would want to do after switching to detail is going to take a look at the optics. This is where we can pick up the enable lens profile corrections. You can see I probably edited this one manually using the geometry panel, but when I come to re-edit this, I'll be looking at applying the lens profile now that it is available. Okay, so let's come over to versions, and let's go back to the original version. And we'll just close this panel. Now, as I said, we'll start by applying that enable lens corrections. There is quite a lot of barrel distortion at the wider focal lengths. It doesn't create a problem for sharpness, it just corrects that slight barrel distortion when we have applied the lens corrections. There is a built-in lens profile applied, which basically removes the chromatic aberration, so we don't need to check that box as well when you see this little eye information, which says basically if I click on that eye, it tells you that the chromatic aberration has been corrected in camera. Now this is quite a beautiful scene here. It was a little bit crowded. You might be surprised. You can see a few people on a rocky outcrop on the top right of the image. But one of the things that we could never quite escape in India was the air pollution. A little bit of smog always floating around, no matter how far we got out of the cities. So one of the things I'll also want to do now is perhaps get a little bit of the contrast and clarity back into this image. So one of the things I could start off is to apply some dehaze. This essentially is why this feature was created, is to remove the haze in the atmosphere. So let's just try and bring in some of the stronger definitions. I'm going to raise that all of the way to plus 40 here, before then carrying on in the light panel, which is the basic panel inside of Lightroom Classic. Now you can see I've got my new defaults applied there, so we'll make a start from there. I could possibly open up the shadows a little bit more. Now the sky is very bright, so one of the things I might want to do before we go much further is to come into the masking panel, select that sky. It'll take a few seconds. It's a big 60 megapixel file. Then we come down into the light panel. You can click on the show overlay if you want to see how that mask was applied. You can see this distant hill in the background hasn't been picked up, whereas the little hill on the left has. So you might want to modify or fine tune these masks. They're not always going to be perfect. Okay, so I'll click off that show overlay and we'll just come in on the exposure and bring that in. You can see it's a little bit on the, it's a little bit blue on the left, but a little bit grey here. So I might just help that out by giving it some temperature to push that into the blues there. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. I'll come back to the light. I think it's probably just a little bit severe. Okay, so we'll apply that, and well, maybe before we leave this panel I'll come in and create a new mask, because I do like those linear gradients from the top and bottom, and so we'll just darken that foreground off, and we'll see the right side of the sky, where basically the light is coming from the upper right side of the image. I can probably sort of balance that with the upper left by adding another linear gradient. This time I'll come in from the top, but I'll angle it down because I don't want it to have too much impact on the upper left hand corner, and we'll lower that again by maybe 2/3 of a stop, and also perhaps add in some cooler color temperatures into that area. Okay, so now that we've finished with the masking panel, I'll probably come in to that light and probably apply even a more contrast, ramp out the whites, so we get some nice bright sparkly tones, also helped out by the dehaze. And let's just check we've got a black point. I think we have. You can see, you'll see that there, if you click on these little triangles, you can actually see if there's any clipping, and we've already got clipping underneath that bush, so I think I'll leave the blacks alone. Already it's looking pretty good. I can come down to the effects panel and maybe add a little bit more clarity into there, and I think we're pretty much done. It's a fast edit, but I just wanted to highlight the select sky and also that dehaze feature there. I'll finish that off. As we've already noted before, we are getting my new default 70 sharpening, and I'll just come in and finish that off with a new version, and so edit 2, and obviously this is now with the new 2070 profile that was made available after I got back from India. Let's take a look at another low contrast landscape that I captured in India. We'll go back to the grid view, and I'll pick up this one here. Now this one, you can see it's it's almost like a panoramic image, but it's just a crop from a single capture. And one of the beauty of using these Alpha 7R cameras is we've got plenty of resolution, even though we've cropped quite tightly on the height of this image. I think one of the reasons for this quite narrow crop is there's just a lot of sky and a lot of water, so the interesting detail sort of gets lost in the negative space that doesn't really contribute well to the image. When we crop it down so tightly, we can then take a much more greater interest in what is happening in the image. We can even see a guy on horseback on the distant headland behind us here, and a lot of those details can get lost if we're just looking at too much negative space. So again, we'll come over to the versions panel, and let's go to the original image here. Now this was captured from a rowing boat, so it's a little bit crooked and it's not the perfect crop that I would have liked. So we'll just close this panel and we'll make a start on this image. We'll start with that crop marquee. We'll just swing it straighter. Now I can come down to the aspect ratio and choose 2:1, which is a narrow crop. I might even go in more aggressively than that. So I might unlock that little padlock that constrains the aspect ratio to one of these defaults, and this now allows me to come even narrower here, and I don't want that boat coming in from the left side, so I'm just going to take that out of the crop. And because this is the focal point with all these birds circling around this boat, that could be in the center of the image like so. And I'll just stretch that out now onto the right, and so this I think is a pretty good crop. Might just take that a little bit lower in the frame there. Okay, and so we'll commit that to the crop. Now we could, in the previous landscape we used dehaze, but what I'll do this time is I'll go into the light panel and just show you how we could perhaps expand out and get some of the dynamic range back into this image just using the whites, blacks and contrast. So I'm going to hold down the Alt Option key and slide that white slider, and you can see I can pretty much take it nearly all of the way because it is such a low contrast image. And we could try the same with the blacks, just pulling the blacks down, and again we can go a long way with these blacks before clipping occurs. And so this is really now giving you that sort of a dynamic outcome that we could have got to by perhaps using or trialing the dehaze, but in this instance I'm getting there just using the blacks and whites. I think I don't need the blacks quite so low, so I'll just come back a little bit there. Okay, so I think we need to perhaps lower the exposure somewhat. Okay, and we could play with the white balance also, just making it slightly warmer because of the rising sun now. We're getting a little bit of a vignette in there. Now remember my new defaults was adding a vignette, and I think this is being exaggerated because of the dramatic plus whites and negative blacks there. So I'm going to come into that effects panel, and instead of having my default at 15, I'm going to zero that out so we don't get those unnaturally darker edges that I was getting in that corner there. I might come in with a linear gradient, just a very subtle one. Obviously the longer you drag these lines, let's just go back one step, do the linear gradient again. The longer you drag these lines, the more subtle the linear gradients are going to be. So I often make sure that I drag these a very long way or when it is appropriate. And then we'll just come down with a small amount of darkening there. And we don't want it to be too grey, so I just want to push in a little bit of saturation there as well. So just to make sure that we're getting a nice rich colour at the top of the image. Another linear gradient at the bottom, really just to draw the eye up to that boat. Again, another long gradient there. Again, we'll come up with a little bit of extra warmth in the water and a little bit of saturation, and also a little bit down on that light, maybe not too much. Okay, so I think pretty much we're already there, and I can show you how quickly we got to this spectacular image captured on the Ganges at dawn. Sometimes when you're photographing portraits of complete strangers, you have a little bit of control. You can sort of direct them to the position you want them to stand or sit in. Sometimes I even move people from full sun into open shade. In this instance, in this flower market, I was very drawn to the relaxed posture and expression of this woman in this flower market. So I didn't really want to move her into shade and then lose that natural expression and pose. So I was working in full sun and the lighting wasn't ideal, I have to say, and you can see how unideal the lighting was. If I just press the backslash key, you can see some of the skin tones are very dark. We've got a very bright highlight on the edge of the nose. The hand, although it's great in the importance of her being relaxed in the sitting, the hand is too bright. So we're going to need to make some quite sweeping tonal changes so this looks a lot more satisfactory than it does at the moment. I'm very pleased with the portrait, just not happy with the distribution of light and shade. So this is where we're going to work on this. So I'll just come over to the edit panel and the versions and then go back to the original edit. Okay, I might want to just do a command undo because I will want to create a snapshot of this current edit just in case I don't make quite a good job of it. So I've created an edit one just in case the next edit isn't quite as good. So I'll go back to the original now, close this panel and come in with the crop tool because we have some distracting elements on the edge here. So we're going to come in until those distracting elements are gone. I want the eyes to be still central, so I need to make sure that the eyes fall inside of these lines on the golden ratio there. So I'm going to come a little bit on the left just to make sure the eyes are absolutely central. Okay, and I think I'm happy with that, and those distracting elements are gone from this side, so we'll commit that as the crop. And now we'll return to the main panel. Let's go into the light panel. You'll see that when we reset the image, we've got the new developed defaults that we created as the starting point for all images by overriding the Adobe default with my own _start preset default. And so this is okay. These are adjustments that I usually want in place for when I'm shooting in sunshine. So these will be appropriate for the starting point for this particular edit. Okay, so without much further ado, let's go into the masking panel, select the background. You'll see it's scanned and found the person as well if we want to start editing her separately. But what I'll do now is I'll go in, let's click on the person first. Just hit the return enter key to make sure that is loaded as a mask, which you can see it is now. And then we'll go in and we'll open up the shadow values of the face there, which is quite nice, leaving the shadow values in the background alone. Okay, we'll create a new mask now of the background. And then lower the exposure, maybe a stop or more, maybe even bring the highlights down as well. And that is good now. It's we're getting balancing the tones already. Now we could go with a brush tool, but I'm going to favor a radial gradient. I think sometimes they're a little bit more subtle than brushing in. There's always the risk we might see where we've been brushing, especially if you don't have enough feather. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a radial gradient for that edge of the hand there. Just going to turn that onto the side, pull that down into position and narrow that radial gradient up so we don't impact the fingers there. Okay, and then we're going to lower that by maybe a stop and also the highlights down, and we're just losing a little bit of saturation, which is sort of to be expected when you're pulling down exposures like this. So we might just raise the saturation or the warmth of that radial gradient so we're matching the skin tones there. Might even come down a little bit more on the exposure. Okay, so now we'll create a new radial gradient. Just press the R key just on the edge of that nose there. So let's just try and define where that highlight is. Bring that down a stop. You'll see it's a lot less saturated than the other one, so I'm going to increase the warmth of that so it doesn't stand out too much. And instead of using the exposure, I might zero that one and try with the highlights first, and maybe even the whites, trying to avoid getting a dark edge along the top of the nose there. So I'll bring down the highlights as much as I can, and again I probably need to come to the color, add a little bit of tint and a little bit more warmth, okay, in order to try and get that highlight just targeted nicely there. And I think I'll leave it at that. It's probably a little bit too much on the highlights, I think. Possibly need to attack this with exposure. It can be a little bit tricky, which is why you're probably seeing that I would prefer to put people in open shade quite a lot of the time. An alternative workflow to using a radial mask and bringing down the whites and highlights would be to go into the healing tool. Now set the feather to perhaps a very generous 70, and also the opacity to 70 as well. These would be good starting points. Now this technique, alternative technique, works a little bit better if your highlights are so bright that you're not bringing or restoring tone into these highlights. So what I'm going to do is with a brush with that soft feather, I'm just going to increase the size of that brush slightly by using that closed square bracket. I'm going to drag this down over that very bright highlight on the nose. And what we're looking for is to pick up some tone. We don't really want that nose stud there, so I'm just going to drag that back in out of the way, so we're only pushing in the skin tones and textures into this healing area here. And what we can do now is look at a before and after. That's the before and that's the heal, and you see that's quite a good technique for pushing skin tone and texture and color back into a very bright highlight area. So that might be a possible alternative to the one that I've just shown you. I'm going to come up with a linear gradient. I've already noticed my next problem on the head covering here is quite bright there. So I'll bring in a linear gradient, and we'll come down. I need to come down right down onto the eyes there. It's mostly taking effect above the center line here, and this is where again I want to pull down the highlights and exposure in order to pull down those highlights. Okay, and I'm okay with that being applied to the background in this instance as well. I've noticed the next problematic highlight, which I'll tackle with a radial filter, and that is it's the edge of this scarf going around her neck, and just pull that down into position, and again exposure and highlights, and I think that's evening it out. Another radial gradient, this time over the eye. And we could do this with brushes. Let's go back and we'll just do this with brushes because I can do it on the same mask this time. So we'll just go in and select a brush. I don't want the auto mask on. I don't want any unnatural edges to this brushing. We're working at 100% flow, 100% density, and brightening it up by half a stop. And we'll just go in and put a little bit of extra light into the dark areas of these eyes because they are quite recessed. Okay, so that's quite good now. So I'm more than happy with the localized edits. I think it's maybe a little bit warm, so I'm going to drop the overall custom temperature down a little bit, so it's a little bit cooler than the auto white balance in the camera had it. And I'm thinking of going down even lower. Okay, and I'm happy with the tint, so I'll leave that there. I might come in now and just put in. You'll notice that the default is already -15 because that was my new start default, but I'm going to pull that down to a higher vignette value just to fine tune that. And I don't need to do the sharpening this time because that has been handled by my new default. So I'm already happy that I am using that new default that I've applied into Lightroom. And that completes the edit in this instance. One more portrait, and again it gives me an opportunity to talk to you about maybe some of my capture techniques, but also some of the post-production workflows that have changed since we've had the new AI masks feature. So if we take a look at the information, this was captured with the Alpha 7R Mark V, the FE20 to 70 to 200 f2.8 GM Mark II. I've been taking this lens to sporting events. This is the first light of day, so we're way up there at ISO 2,500, even though my shutter speed is at the default for portraits, which is 1/250th of a second. Do like to keep that default 1/250th of a second. You know, when you're working at these events where people are milling around and moving, slower shutter speeds will usually result in a little bit of blur, not because of focus area, just because of subject movement. You'll see I'm working at 108 millimeters. I am used to sort of working with those 85mm primes, so in this instance I'm using a 70-200 instead of an 85mm maximum aperture, and it gives me an opportunity now to show you the before and after as well. Holding down the backslash key shows you the before. It's not a huge difference, but it does bring into the focal point that is the center of attention, so it's got a little bit more saturation. Some of the periphery bright tones are darkened down, so I'll just show you how I've tackled that. So we'll go into the edit panel and let's take a look at the versions. I've got an edit version for this already, so I'll go and show the original. And we'll go and select the crop tool to begin with. He's pretty much central here, but I think there's probably a little bit too much on the left side in this instance. This does give me an opportunity to talk to you about the way I'm composing these images. It's going to be slightly off center, but I don't mind that. I just want to get rid of some of the distractions on that left side in this instance now. So we'll apply that crop. Now, of course, what I'm doing here in the capture stage is I'm sort of layering the image. Making sure this guy is partially obscured by this guy in front of him on the left. Just by a small side step to the left, I get a little bit of this defocused area in front, and then of course we've got layers going back. I do like building up depth in the capture. I'm not always looking for a clean sweep target. Okay, so let's go over to the edit. First of all, I can darken down this guy's cap without going into the masks. I can basically do that in the color panel, color mixer, and we'll go down into luminance, and I'll click on that on image tool so I don't have to guess what the color is. I can do that manually. You can see I can darken that down to like, it's mostly on the magentas there, a little bit of purple. Notice how it's targeted two sliders, not just a single slider, because that color mostly sits in the magenta, but a little bit towards the purple. So that's the advantage of using that on image slider for darkening that. I'll now go into the masks and we'll select the background. Now this might be a difficult background for it to select, and we've got the mask overlay switched on there. I knew it was going to have a little bit of a problem here. There's a bit of a hole in the mask here which we could fill in by basically selecting a plus. I can also show you that we can expand this panel, so you can hit the add, which is the plus, and then that gives us an option to add another tool. I'll brush it in, and here I'll just brush in that hole in that mask, so that will follow suit when I go into the light panel and lower the brightness of that background. Okay, so that's already starting to look a lot better. I could darken the base, which you've probably seen me do many times before, linear gradient, and just come up with a linear gradient at the bottom, minus third stop, another one at the top, which will also darken that cap down a little bit, and that's also got a good outcome there, half a stop there. Okay, so we'll come out of the masks, we'll go into the effects. The vignette is already set at -15, but I might go down and push that down to -25. You have to be aware that your vignettes are not too aggressive. If you notice you've got a vignette in the grid view, then you basically overcook that vignette. You are going to get people noticing that you've applied a vignette. They really need to be subtle enough so people are not aware of your post-production editing techniques. We'll go into the light panel first, just to optimize the whites. We are working with the the starting points. None of these starting points have been adjusted, which you can see why they're appropriate for me as defaults, new default starting points. Just go and select a white point just there with a few highlights just starting to appear there, and on the blacks should be no problem here. We don't really need to do a negatives blacks, and that again is, even though I'm working with a telephoto lens, I am at close proximity, so we're getting good density on the blacks in camera there. We could increase the contrast a little bit more. Maybe on the color I'll just increase the vibrance a little bit more. If you want the skin tones to follow suit, you might have to give a little bit of a kick with the saturation as well, because those are held back with the vibrance slider. You'll notice all of the colors going quite vibrant except skin tones, often with that vibrant slider. So that pretty much sums up that image. I know it's already been sharpened by the defaults, and that would leave me nothing more to do than to select a new edit version, edit 2, and I'll select OK. You'll see in the previous edit 1, which I've done, I actually left a little bit more in on the left and kept him more central. In the edit 2, I've moved him a little bit more over to the side. Also notice in the edit 1, I've gone for a little bit more warmth. Okay, these things are going to change each time you edit. If you are doing a batch of images from the same event, you probably want to get some consistency over saturation levels and white balance, but on a single edit, pretty much it's up to you where you lean that image in the direction. Okay, and I'll move on to the next image. Let's edit this image that I captured at the Australian MotoGP using my Alpha 7R5 and also the FE 400mm f2.8 GM. That's the prime lens. So let's go in and just double click and look at the edit of this one. Okay, so we'll go into the editing panel here, and I'll look at the versions, and we'll can see I've already got the saved version, but I'm now going to go back to the original. Now obviously I didn't get the tight enough crop that I wanted because this wasn't a zoom lens, this was a prime. Plenty of resolution however, so we can crop in post. So that's the first thing I'll do, is I'll just come in and crop. Now I can cycle through, and this time I'm using, instead of the golden ratio that we've been using previously, I'm just going tapping the O key a couple more times, well 4 times, and then coming down to the rule of thirds. In this particular instance I'm going to put that lower line onto the top of the racetrack there, and we just need to rotate that slightly so we get a nice even line there across the top of that racetrack. Okay, so that will be my framing in this instance. I think I framed it differently last time, but this is how I'm choosing to frame it now. Now we probably want to lock that into a 2:3 aspect ratio, or you could choose one of these alternate ones like maybe 16:10, but that of course means that I've got to now reframe again to put the racetrack back onto that rule of thirds. Okay, so I'll leave it at that one before we change my mind again and come back out into the edit. Now first off, let's take a look at the light panel. I've got the defaults that are my overridden defaults. They're not all zeroed out, they're my new defaults that I showed you how to modify earlier. So we're getting lighter shadows that we weren't getting from the outset. The sky is a little bit too bright for me, I think, so it's darker from memory, and I do want a nice rich blue sky that I do remember on this particular day of the race event. So we're going to come over to the masking panel, and we're going to select sky. You can see the AI has actually selected each individual rider separately. You'll notice by looking at the mask overlays that none of these are actually perfect. We got a little bit of the wheel missing here, we got a little bit of the sky included, whereas on person 1 again we got a little bit of the wheel missing from the mask, and we've also got a little bit of sky. So these masks, although they're a huge labour saving exercise, they're not always perfect, and so I dare say they'll get increasingly better over time, but they're still not perfect yet. So this gives me an opportunity to talk to you about how we can fine-tune and perfect masks. So I'm going to select the sky, and it'll take a few seconds because it's that 60 megapixel file. We can click on the show overlay to see how it's been doing, and you can see some of the gaps in the sky. Because they're not contiguous to the main area of sky, it doesn't really know whether they're part of the subject, and you see a little gap there as well. If you want to get a much clearer idea of this, we can come over to that masking icon here and click on it and look at that the color we're using, because we can change the color of the mask. We can also change the overlay mode, and if you wanted just to see it as a white on black mask, I could in fact do that, and you could see that the masks are not super accurate to the edges, so we do get a little bit of a soft edge around these. We could fine-tune this using a brush tool if we wanted to try and perfect these masks. I'm going to come back to the color overlay here, and what we are going to do is we are going to work on these little bits of sky. It's going to look a bit odd if I start darkening the sky and we have these islands of sky still as they are. So I'm going to click on the add. We're going to choose the brush tool. Now we can have auto mask selected if we're trying to stay behind the harder edges here. So I'm going to zoom in because we're going to use a slightly smaller brush, and then we're going to add to the mask here. Now we want the density all of the way over at 100 and the flow at 100 in order to put the mask in with a single brush stroke. And this auto mask feature will help us stay behind the lines if we're not very careful with the brush tool. And so let's just go in and add that little bit of the mask over there, and now cycle over and look at any areas here. I notice this is fading out as it goes towards the bike, so I'm going to push that back in at full strength this time, so we get a nice continuous tone running all of the way. If we're having trouble locating where the other areas, I'll just do a command or control minus, use the space bar to reposition the image, command or control plus to zoom in again, and one more time add in that sky into the mask that we've got working here. Basically all of the area with the overlay is what we're going to be using to darken the sky. If you're being super fussy here, there's a tiny little bit of sky in here I could also add in there. Okay, let's zoom out and check our mask is all good to go. We probably could spend a lot longer on this, and if you wanted to be super fussy, you could go into that white on black mask, and you could clean up some of these masks here now. Again, I think I'll just leave it as is, but you can see that even my work here, they're just approximations, and we could spend a lot more time working on these particular masks. But without much further ado, let's come over to the light panel and switch off the show overlay mode and just drop that sky down. I'm very interested just to make sure that I can't see the brush marks here, and actually I can on that area, so I do want to select that brush and just go in with a slightly larger brush and make sure that we're not seeing any of those edges of the brush marks that I've been painting in manually, because that's a definite no-no. We've got a little bit of a gap there that I can see that I just want to add in there as well. Okay, so we've lowered the exposure by half a stop. I also want to make it a little bit bluer, so I'm coming in with a negative temperature now. Okay, so I'll close that mask and revert to the main light panel. So let's just command minus to just a fit in screen there now. Okay, so the masks are pretty good. I'm thinking I want a slightly darker top, so I think I'll return to this mask panel, and it'll give me an opportunity just to show you another masking technique that we have available to us. I'll first start with a linear gradient. I'll drag this linear gradient down, and I want to darken the top of the sky, but you'll probably realize that I'm actually going to darken the riders as well. Let's take a look at that. We'll darken by half a stop. Now if I want to not darken the riders' helmets and heads here, what we can do is we can hit the subtract from mask and select subject there. And again, what we can do now is inspect that mask. If you want to be super critical again, we can just let's just expand that mask out again and click on the white on black, so that when we hover over the mask you can see, yes, we've managed to exclude that from the linear gradient, so the bright tones in those white helmets will be nice and bright again. Okay, so now we've got that mask selected. I'm just going to come in with one more linear gradient from the bottom of the image to the top. We're seeing that in the mask overlay, so probably want to switch back to color overlay here. Now I do want to keep the saturation very high, even though we're darkening the exposure here. I don't want this dark grey coming in through that exposure, so I'll go over to the color, add in some saturation and maybe a little bit of warmth and some on the greens there. So this is a beautifully saturated foreground color that we've got going here. Okay, so that shows you a few more masking tools that you can use by adding and subtracting from your existing masks there. And what we'll do now is we'll come into the versions and just add a new version. Before I do that, I just noticed just before we were going to do that, I've got a little blemish in the sky. I think I'm going to go back and fix that. You might not be able to notice that. It's very, very subtle. I'm not actually too sure what it is, because shooting at f2.8, it's probably not a dust spot on the sensor, but it is a blemish I'm noticing. So we'll come over into that healing tool. Now if you're having trouble seeing that clearly, you can click on the visualize spots. Okay, and if you move the threshold up over to the right, now you can clearly see that dust spot. This is very useful if you've got very subtle dust spots, and you will often be looking for them when you've stopped down to f11, f16 on your sensor. If your sensor isn't spotlessly clean, and this is an opportunity now to remove these dust spots in post-production. And we'll click off that visualize spots, and you can see that spot is now gone. Okay, so now we'll go back to the versions and save my edit 2 version. Okay, and that concludes that, and I'll return back into the grid of images that I've been editing. Okay, one more portrait, but this one does allow me to showcase an editing feature that sometimes I do in Photoshop, but if I can get away with it by doing it in Lightroom, I will. And if I lean on that backspace key, you'll see what I'm about to show you. Before I do that, I'll just point out this was an Alpha 7R Mark V 2070 f4G. I have stopped down, started with my portrait setting, but stopped down again for the reason of making sure that I've got the beard, the headdress, the eyes and all the face all pin sharp, not just the eyes. This was a nature of or a style of my capture technique when working in India, just stopping down a little bit more than often I will work when people don't have beards. Okay, so let's put the backslash key down, and you can see the before. It's a little bit cooler. The white balance has got it slightly cool in this instance, so I definitely prefer the warming that up. But you'll notice that the wall behind this guy has got some geometric lines, and those are too distracting for me. Now again, if there was an opportunity to move this guy or choose a slightly different angle of view, I would, but he was sitting also almost on a high pedestal, and obviously there wasn't not going to be an opportunity, or a very limited opportunity, to be able to choose a different angle of view or move the sitter. So I've elected to try and move those lines, or remove those lines in post-production. And now that I've pointed it out, you'll probably see where I've been working, but had I not pointed that out, you'd probably be unaware of what's happening in the background there. And here's another one, and I'll probably demonstrate it on this one. This was another opportunity I got to photograph. This time I have left the aperture wide open at f4, and even at f4, because of the close proximity, you can see the eyes are pin sharp, but the moustache has gone out of focus. So sometimes I'll go even wider than this. I'll go f1.8, 1.4, but sometimes you just have to decide how much focus you want, and there's no wrongs or rights here. Okay, so let's take a look with the backslash key in this instance, and there's the geometric line. I did try removing that by choosing a slightly lower or higher vantage point, but the peak cap also served to make this a little bit problematic, so I really had no other option other than to remove this in post-production. Can usually do. It's a little, you got a little bit more flexibility and a few more options inside of Photoshop, but increasingly we're not having to go into Photoshop these days, and more often than not we can do it in Lightroom. So let's go and take a look at this edit, and rather than just look at that one side of that edit, I'll just go into the versions, and I'll create a version of this edit first so I don't lose this particular edit. And then I'll come back to the original edit. Slightly crooked, you can see there, but mostly that's all I need to do is just straighten the image. It is reasonably central in the composition as well, so that's all I need to do there. We've got that bottom of the bottom of that silver badge there, so I might just pull that a little bit lower so that isn't a distraction right on the edge of the frame there, and reasonably happy with that crop. You can always press the F key on the keyboard and look at it without the interface just to make sure you're comfortable with the composition. Before I go and remove that line, you'll see the peak cap, even though I'm in shade here, not full sunlight, that peak cap does stop the skylight from lighting that part of the face. So what I'll do is with a radial gradient, I'll come in and lighten that up just where the shade is falling over the top part of his face, and I'll raise that until it just seems appropriate, which is around about half a stop. Now you'll see that it lightens up the peak cap as well, so we could subtract that. We could use another radial gradient or a brush just to subtract that from the mask there, and I can do that freehand without the auto mask. You could lean on the mask to help keep you behind the line. As you can see, as I go near the line, it keeps me behind the edge of that cap there. Okay, and so I'll switch off the overlay so we can see that adjustment, and that's really quite good, so I'm happy with that. So this is where we'll come in and try and remove that this background line. I might come back in and try and darken this background slightly as well, but now that I'm here in the healing tool, I'll try and remove this. The best tools for the job may vary depending on what you're trying to do here, but we've got three options. We've got the content aware remove, which is the latest one. This might be good. You can read the instructions for each of the options here. Then we've got the heal, and then we've got the clone stamp, which is the original one that came shipped with the very first version of Photoshop, and it's this one that I'm going to choose at the tricky edge where this line sort of intersects with the ear. I'm going for quite a healthy amount of feather here, and again there's not going to be no set values, but I am going to use some feather, and I'm going to work at 100% opacity, and I'm just going to click over the edge of the ear where that dark line goes into that ear, and then I'm going to try and reposition that and try and pick up some of the edge of the ear just above there and just sort of slide that in to place in order to create a continuation of that ear. And as you can see, it's a little bit of a trial and error job. I'm not too sure whether that's the most effective use or whether people will believe the ear continues in that fashion, but we'll see when I've done the rest of the job. Is I'll pick up the next one along, which is that heel, and now with a healthy amount of feather, maybe slightly larger. I want that inner circle to actually cover the dark line. I'm going to click once over here right on the edge of the frame, and then hold down the shift key, click a second time just on the edge. If you move into this heel area, you're going to remove the possibility of adding this. So I'm just going to go right up to the edge, click one more time, and it's going to find its source point, which is a really bad choice. So I'm going to have to drag that down into a clean area of tone such as this. Okay, and then we just basically have to look at whether the image is believable or not. There's a little bit of a light halo there, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to this clone stamp tool. Now again, I can't approach the actual healing areas, so I might have to just make a small line generally that I want to move into position, and then drag that down into position over that heel area. And now I'm going to choose a darker source point until I can get a good heel area, and I think about there, and I think possibly I might get away with that. As I said, sometimes these jobs are just not possible and you have to sort of go into Photoshop to do these. Okay, so I'll attempt this on the other side, but this time I'll switch over to the heel to begin with and make sure I've still got some feather and 100% opacity, maybe a slightly larger brush size. I'm using the closed square bracket. Just going to come over the edge of that ear. So I've got the edge of the ear in that circle, then coming over to the left hand side, clicking right at the edge, holding down the shift key as I click a second time. Now let's see if we can pull this into alignment. Just going to go slightly higher on the ear, maybe see if I can pull that into position. Yeah, that's maybe I should go down below the ear instead. Oh no, that looks like it's, I think that'll be fairly undetectable. If you've got a little bit of few repetitions of pattern, you could just try clicking a second time to try and get rid of any repetitions that might be occurring. Like we got that spot being duplicated twice there, and I think we'll get away with that. Okay, you probably see where I've been, but I don't suppose most people will be looking at the edges of the ears when they're looking at this guy. I noticed this shoulder is a little bit brighter than I would like, so I'll just go in with a radial filter and just drop that down over the shoulder and just rotate that into place and bringing that down a little bit. And if I want to remove the edge there, I could subtract, use a brush and just subtract that background there. Again, in the masks, I'll create a new mask. I'll select the background and just darken that off half a stop or so, so it's not competing with the tones in the jacket and the face. And I think that will do. I think I probably could have done a better job with a little bit more time. Happy with the ear on this side. I might have a second stab at this ear on this side, but it's okay for the demonstration. As you can see, it's a bit of trial and error, but you can remove some distractions in the background in Lightroom without going into Photoshop.